Okay, another point to think about is whether or not the book you're reading is current or up to date. Now, this one is kind of tricky because it doesn't always matter if it's current or up to date, all right? But if you're reading a book in science, biology, medicine, if you're reading a book in technology, then it's really important that whatever you're reading is up to date. It's the latest and greatest, most recent information, because information in science, and especially information in technology, changes so rapidly, right? So like if you're about to get out of prison, you've been down for 30 years, you don't know anything about computers and the internet, you wouldn't want to read a book that was written in the 1990s, right? You would want to read a book that was written like in the 2020s because it's going to have a lot more up-to-date, accurate information about computers and the internet. Same thing with science. You don't want to read a book on biology or chemistry that was written in the 1950s. You want to read one that was written in the last few years. So this happened in one of the classes I was teaching. It was a civics class. And the guy brought a book to me that was written in the 1960s. And the book was talking about certain like historical and genealogical theories about like race and history and politics. And the book was actually published by a decent press. And the guy who wrote it had an education, but it was from the 1960s. And so I told him, there's probably been books written since the 1960s that have updated these theories and either proven them false or updated them with new information or something like that. So you should try to read something more up to date. However, it's not always important to read up-to-date works. For example, I'm also teaching a class right now in ethics, and we're reading the works of Plato. Well, that was written, 2,500 years ago. But if you're trying to understand Plato, you want to read the actual work of Plato. And so reading a book 2,500 years old is not as big of a deal in the realm of philosophy, or theology or history, if you're an historian. If you're trying to understand how things were in the 1600s, then reading works that were published in the 1600s would help you understand the 1600s better. So having a book that's up to date is important, but really it's more important in certain subjects. In fact, if you're going to write a research paper in school, maybe not always the schools that are in prison because you're very limited, but like if you're in the free world at a university, like when I did my dissertation in order to get my doctorate degree, I was not allowed to use sources that were more than 10 or 15 years old. So I was in school for my doctorate between 2018 and 2021. So they wouldn't let me use sources that were in the 1990s or earlier, or really even before 2005. I could only use sources that were 10 or 15 years old at the max. That's something that I didn't understand when I first got out of prison. I got out of prison and I was making, A's in the school that I was at. The college that I was taking, I was making A's. But then when I got out, one of the things I didn't understand was how to do proper research and how to use the internet, both of which were very important if you're going to be in a free world university. And so when I made a D on that first experimental psychology class because it was like I was learning how to do research at the same time I was on parole and just in school. It was a lot of stuff. And I got a D on that research paper because I didn't understand a lot of these ideas. And one of them was you can't just use any old source. It has to be from, the right kind of journal. It has to be up to date and current. That's because they want to make sure that your understanding is current and according to the latest research. So just look at the when your book was published, and depending on the topic, if it's science or technology versus philosophy or theology, it might be more important if it's up to date. Now, what about internet sources, right? So when I went to prison and I was in there in the late 90s and early 2000s, the internet was really just becoming big. And my grandmother was one of the people who would write me regularly and help me find information on the internet. So she learned a lot about how to navigate the internet through helping me, because I didn't really know a lot about the internet, but I just would ask her, hey, can you look this up for me or look that up for me? Well, at the time, she didn't understand and I didn't understand how to distinguish whether what we're looking at on the internet was reliable. Now, you can imagine that all I've said so far about how to distinguish reliable sources in books, you can imagine how difficult it can be sometimes to distinguish whether stuff on the internet is reliable. And that is actually a whole other conversation that I'll have to make in addition to this. And you guys and ladies, now that you have the tablets, you're actually getting information that is normally on the internet. And so it will be important for you to understand how to distinguish reliable information from the internet because you have something like that on your tablets. But here's an example. Wikipedia. Many of you have heard of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an online encyclopedia, but most of the time, you're not allowed to use Wikipedia if you're writing a research paper at school. And that's because of the way that Wikipedia is created and designed, which will get us off subject. But the Wikipedia is like an encyclopedia created by people like me and the public. We can just create an account and then we can go in there and write stuff on a certain subject. There's certain ways that they fact check things, but it's not nearly as reliable as some of the other sources. So Wikipedia is an internet encyclopedia that a lot of people go to find, quick and fast information about the world, but it's not allowed to be used in a lot of your research because it's unreliable. But then there are things like Encyclopedia Britannica. So back in the day, you might have the Encyclopedia Britannica, like I have one that's the Great Books of the Western World, but it would be this, huge set of hardback books that people would be able to look up information about the world. Well, with the advent of the internet, they have put the Encyclopedia Britannica online. So now you can go online and look it up. So if you're going to choose where to get information on the internet, then somewhere like Encyclopedia Britannica is more reliable than Wikipedia. If you're a philosophy fan, then the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a free internet encyclopedia of philosophy that is overseen by Stanford University. And that has become extremely popular in the last 10 or 15 years. I use it all the time. I use it in my classes. I use it in my teaching. Because since Stanford University is overseeing the things that are put out, then it has a level of reliability that is much higher than Wikipedia. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is another one. It's free. It's online. It's overseen by University of Missouri, I think. So that's another one that is what we would call peer-reviewed because there are people with an education in philosophy who are overseeing the editing and what's put out there. But you have to do a lot of search to know whether or not the information you're getting on the internet is reliable. It's much more detailed than the way that you would do it for books. But just keep that in mind because anything that your family sends you off the internet, that doesn't necessarily mean it's reliable. The organizations that sponsor particular websites might want the information to be skewed or biased in a certain way, and you don't necessarily know that unless you know who sponsored that website.